The music was a ghost, a whisper of a waltz from a time before the house held its breath. Alara held Sophia's hands, her own strong and steady against the old woman's, which were as delicate as dried leaves. Sophia's eyes, milky with age but bright with a sudden, fierce joy, were locked on hers. In the grand, silent parlor, surrounded by furniture shrouded in white cloths like sleeping giants, they danced. Alara moved backward in slow, careful steps, her dark blue uniform a stark contrast to the pale dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. Sophia's wheelchair followed, guided by the gentle pull of their joined hands, its wheels a soft shush against the polished marble floor. For a woman who had not walked in a decade, she was surprisingly light on her wheels. A small, breathless laugh escaped Sophia's lips, a sound as fragile as old lace. It was a stolen moment, a small rebellion against the oppressive quiet of the Moretti mansion. Alara had been hired to care for the matriarch, a job that mostly consisted of silence, medication schedules, and pushing the wheelchair from one silent room to another. But she had seen a flicker in Sophia's eyes one afternoon when an old record played on a distant radio. A memory, a hunger for something more than waiting. So, she had found the old phonograph in the parlor, its brass horn tarnished with neglect. She had found the records, and now they danced. This was the world she thought she was in. A quiet, gilded cage where her only duty was to bring a little life to its forgotten prisoner. She was just the help invisible. However, the world she was actually in had a master, and he had just come home. The music did not so much stop as it was shattered by the sound of the heavy oak door opening. The waltz died, the needle scratching across the vinyl with a sound of protest. A shadow fell across the long expanse of the foyer, a figure so still and immense in his presence that he seemed to suck all the light and air from the room. Dante Moretti did not move. He simply stood on the threshold, his hand still on the doorknob, and watched them. Alara's blood went cold, the warmth of the dance turning to ice in her veins. She dropped Sophia's hands as if they had burned her. The silence that rushed back and was heavier than before, thick with judgment and a cold, predatory stillness. She could not leave. She worked here. She lived here. And she had just been caught taking a liberty in a house where liberties were not given, only taken by the man who owned it all. His eyes, the color of wet slate, moved from his mother's face, still flushed with illicit joy, to Alara. They were flat, analytical, and utterly unreadable. He wore a dark suit, tailored so perfectly it seemed a part of him, an armor of wealth and power. A heavy gold signet ring on his pinky finger was the only ornament, and it caught the light with a dull, dangerous gleam. He had not been expected for hours. His schedule was as rigid and predictable as the tides. But here he was, and the look on his face was not one of amusement. "What is this?" His voice was low, a gravelly timbre that vibrated through the marble floor. It was not a question so much as a demand for an explanation she did not have. Sophia's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear.
"Dante.
You're home early." He ignored his mother, his gaze remaining locked on Alara. She felt pinned by it, like an insect under glass. Her training, her instincts, everything screamed at her to be small, to apologize, to fade back into the woodwork. I'm sorry, Mr. Moretti. We were just... I can see what you were doing," he cut her off, his voice dropping even lower. He took a step into the room, and then another. The sound of his handmade leather shoes on the marble was the only sound. It was the sound of a judge approaching the bench. "My mother does not dance." "She wanted to," Alara said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the wrong thing to say. It was a defense, and he was not a man who tolerated being contradicted by his staff.
He stopped a few feet from them.
He smelled of cedar and cold winter air. "You will go to the kitchen. You will wait for me there." It was an order, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed. Alara's gaze flickered to Sophia, whose face had crumpled into a mask of disappointment and fear. Leaving her alone with him in this state felt like a betrayal. But one look back at Dante's face told her she had no choice. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod and turned, her own uniform feeling suddenly cheap and ill-fitting under his stare. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. She had worked in the homes of the wealthy before. She knew the rules. Be invisible. Be silent. Do your job. Today, she had broken all of them for a ghost of a waltz, and she was certain she was about to pay the price. The kitchen was a cavern of stainless steel and white tile, cold and sterile. Alleyways stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, forcing herself to breathe slowly. She could hear the murmur of voices from the parlor, Dante's low rumble and Sophia's higher, pleading tones. Then silence. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She braced herself for the arrival of the head of security, a man named Marco with dead eyes and a permanent scowl, to escort her from the premises. That was how this ended. A quiet dismissal, a final paycheck, and a warning to forget everything she had seen or heard in this house. But it was Dante who appeared in the doorway, filling it completely. He had taken off his suit jacket, and the white of his shirt was stark against the shadows of the hall behind him. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. The posture was casual, but the tension in his shoulders was anything but. "You've been here 3 months, Alara," he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different. Foreign. Not the soft, familiar sound she was used to, but something hard and precise, each syllable a clipped judgment. "Yes, sir. In those 3 months, my mother has spoken more than she has in the last year. She has asked for things. She has taken an interest in the gardens. Today, she was laughing." He listed the facts like an auditor reviewing a ledger, each one a mark in a column she couldn't see.
Why?
The question caught her off guard. She had expected anger, accusations of overstepping her bounds. Not this cold analysis. I talked to her, sir. I ask her what she remembers. I play the music she liked when she was young. I thought." "You thought," he repeated, the words sharp. "What you are paid to do is ensure her comfort and her safety, not to indulge her in fantasies." It wasn't a fantasy, Alara found herself saying, a spark of defiance lighting in the cold fear. It was a memory. It made her happy. He pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. He stopped when he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. The scent of cedar was stronger now, mixed with something else. Something clean and metallic, like fresh rain on stone. "Happiness is a liability in this house," he said, his voice a low growl. "Emotion is a weakness. It can be used. Do you understand what I am telling you?" She understood perfectly. She saw the armed men at the gates, the bulletproof glass in the windows, the constant, humming tension that lay beneath the surface of the mansion's opulent silence. This was not just a rich man's home. It was a fortress, and he was its king. "Yes," she whispered. "My father," he began, his voice changing, a note of something raw and ancient creeping in, "died because he let his guard down for a moment. One moment. He chose sentiment over security. He paid for it. My mother paid for it. I will not make the same mistake," his wound, she realized. He was not just speaking about business. He was showing her the scar he carried, the failure he was determined never to repeat. She thought this was it, the speech before she was fired. She braced for the inevitable words. "Therefore, your employment is terminated." But he said something else. "From now on, you will report to me every evening. At 9 o'clock. In my study. You will tell me everything about her day. Every word she says. Every mood. Every request. Nothing is too small. Nothing is irrelevant. You are no longer just her caregiver. You are my eyes and ears. Is that clear?" Alara's breath hitched. This was worse than being fired. Being fired was freedom. This was a promotion into the heart of the prison. It was forced proximity, a daily audience with the one man she wanted to avoid at all costs. She would not be invisible anymore. She would be seen, scrutinized, and held accountable by him directly. Her quiet, simple job was over. "Yes, Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice hollow. Perfectly clear. He held her gaze for a beat longer, his slate-gray eyes searching hers for something: insubordination, fear, deceit. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it. He gave a single, curt nod and turned, walking out of the kitchen without another word, leaving her alone in the cold, echoing silence. She had thought she could keep her head down, do her job, and remain separate from the dark world that funded this house. But with that single command, Dante Moretti had pulled her in. The door she needed open, the one to a quiet, anonymous exit, had just been slammed shut and locked. The nightly reports began that same evening. His study was on the second floor, a room of dark wood, leather-bound books, and the faint smell of tobacco and old paper. It was a room that felt like him, controlled, imposing, and silent. Allera would stand before his massive mahogany desk while he sat, listening without expression as she detailed Sophia's day. What she ate, the chapter of the book they'd read aloud, the brief time they had spent on the terrace. Dante rarely looked at her during these reports. His focus was usually on the papers before him, his pen making sharp, decisive notes. But she felt his attention on her like a physical weight. He would ask questions, his voice a low rumble that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. What was her mood when she woke? Did she speak of her brother? Did she seem agitated after the doctor's call? They were simple questions, but they felt like interrogations. He was mapping his mother's mind through Allera's observations, searching for any sign of weakness, any emotional vulnerability he could preemptively fortify. Allera answered with professional detachment, giving him the facts and nothing more. She did not mention the way Sophia's eyes lit up when she saw a cardinal in the garden, or the soft, humming sound she made when Allera brushed her long, silver hair. Those moments felt too private, too pure for this cold, tactical room. They were her secrets with Sophia, a small pocket of rebellion he could not touch. One evening, about a week into this new routine, the tension in the house escalated. There was a palpable shift, a sharpening of the edges. The number of guards at the gate doubled. Marco, the head of security, was a constant, grim presence in the halls. Allera could hear the low, urgent murmur of conversations from behind the closed doors of the study before her appointed time. She knew better than to ask what was happening. Her world was confined to Sophia's wing of the mansion. That night, when she entered the study at 9, Dante was not at his desk. He was standing by the tall window, looking out at the darkened grounds, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was still in his suit, but his tie was loosened and his top button undone. He looked tired, the hard lines of his face etched deeper in the dim lamplight. "Report," he said without turning around. She began, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Sophia had a good day.
She ate well.
We spent an hour in the solarium. She spoke about the olive groves at her family's home in Sicily. At the mention of Sicily, he tensed. He turned slowly from the window, his eyes narrowed. What did she say? Just memories. The smell of the blossoms in spring. The taste of the fresh oil. He stared at her, his gaze intense. Nothing else? No names? No mention of the Rizzos. The name meant nothing to her.
No, sir.
Just memories of her childhood. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She felt a prickle of unease. This was more than his usual paranoia. This was specific. This was a threat. There was an incident today, he said finally, his voice flat. In the city. A message was sent by the Rizzo family. They believe I have something that belongs to them. Allera's throat went dry. She was an employee. This had nothing to do with her. She just needed to stand here, be still, and wait for dismissal. You should leave, he said, the words so unexpected she wasn't sure she heard him correctly. This is not a safe place for you right now. Marco can drive you to the city. I will have a severance package arranged. You can be gone in an hour.
It was the out she had thought she wanted.
Freedom. A return to her normal, uncomplicated life. All she had to do was say yes. She opened her mouth to accept, to thank him and walk out of this house and this life forever. But an image flashed in her mind. Sophia, sitting alone in her room, the silence pressing in on her again, the light in her eyes dimming, the joy from their dance fading into just another ghost. Dante was offering Alara an escape, but in doing so, he was sentencing his mother back to her silent prison. He would protect her, yes, but he would not bring her joy.
He didn't know how.
He saw her happiness as a liability to be managed, not a life to be lived. No, Alara said, the word tasting strange and bold on her tongue. Dante's eyebrows drew together in a faint, sharp line.
No.
I won't leave her, Alara clarified, her voice gaining strength. She needs me. He walked toward the desk, setting his glass down with a heavy, definitive click. What she needs is to be kept safe. Your presence here, a civilian with no ties, no understanding of this world, complicates that. You are a vulnerability. Maybe, she conceded, meeting his gaze without flinching. Or maybe a little bit of happiness is worth the risk. They stood there, locked in a battle of wills across the expanse of polished mahogany. He, the king of this dark, violent kingdom, and she, the maid who refused to abandon her post. For the first time, she wasn't just his employee. She was a woman making a choice, and her choice was to stay. It was a foolish, reckless decision, and every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to run. But when she looked at this cold, formidable man, she saw the flicker of his own wound. He was so terrified of losing what was left of his family that he was suffocating it with his protection. He saw her as a danger, but she knew she was the only one in this house who saw his mother as a person. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. She saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the granite facade. It wasn't approval. It was a reluctant, grudging respect. He had offered her a door, and she had deliberately chosen to stay inside the cage with them. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Very well, but you will not leave the grounds. Not for any reason. From this moment on, you are under my protection, which means you are also under my command. Do you understand? I understand, she said. He gestured toward her sleeve, where a loose thread from her uniform cuff had come undone. Before she could react, he reached out, his large, warm fingers brushing against her wrist as he deftly tucked the thread back into the seam. The touch was brief, impersonal, almost clinical, but it was the first time he had touched her, and a jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot up her arm. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up and found him watching her, his eyes dark and unreadable. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with his business or his mother. It was something else entirely, something new and far more dangerous. Because she had chosen to stay, she was no longer just the help. Therefore, to the world outside these walls, she was now one of his. A piece on his board. And that made her a target. The attack came 2 days later. It was not subtle. There was no warning. Alara was pushing Sophia's wheelchair along a stone path in the rose garden, a secluded area walled in by high hedges. The afternoon sun was warm, and Sophia was telling a story about her wedding day, her voice thin but animated. It was a peaceful moment, a fragile bubble of normalcy in the tense atmosphere of the estate. Then the world exploded. A deafening roar ripped through the air as a section of the outer perimeter wall disintegrated into a cloud of brick and dust. Gunfire erupted, the sharp, staccato cracks of automatic weapons shattering the afternoon quiet. Men in dark clothing were pouring through the breach. Alara's training was non-existent. Her instincts were pure, primal fear. Her first thought was Sophia. She shoved the wheelchair behind a thick, marble bench, her body shielding the old woman's. "Stay down," she screamed, her voice hoarse with terror. One of the intruders saw them. He was big, bearded, his face a mask of brutal intent. He raised his rifle, the black hole of the barrel seeming to swallow all the light in the world. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, a useless prayer on her lips. A blur of motion, a dark shape moving with impossible speed.
Dante.
He had come from a house, moving not like a man running, but like a force of nature. He didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. He slammed into the gunman, a short, vicious blade appearing in his hand as if from nowhere. There was a sickening, wet sound, and the man crumpled to the ground. Two more intruders were turning their weapons toward them. Dante moved to intercept, placing his body squarely between them and the bench where Alara and Sophia huddled. He drew a handgun from the small of his back, the movements economical and brutally efficient. 2 shots, so close together they sounded like one. Both men fell. It was over in seconds. Dante's own security team swarmed the garden, their own weapons firing, driving the remaining attackers back. But in that brief, violent eternity, Alara had seen the truth of him. She had seen the cold, lethal precision. He moved through violence like it was his native language. He turned back to them, his face a grim, emotionless mask. But his eyes, when they met Alara's, were blazing with a terrifying fire. There was a dark red stain spreading across the sleeve of his white shirt. He was hurt. Inside. Now, he commanded, his voice strained. Marco and another guard helped her get Sophia into the house, into a reinforced panic room hidden behind a tapestry in the main hall. Dante followed them in, sealing the heavy steel door behind them. The room was small, lit by emergency lights, with its own air supply and communications. Sophia was weeping softly, her body trembling with shock. Alara knelt by her side, murmuring soothing words, her own hands shaking uncontrollably. Dante leaned against the wall, his breathing harsh. The cut on his arm was deep, a long, clean slice from his bicep to his forearm. Blood dripped onto the pristine floor. "You're hurt," Alara said, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," he bit out, his jaw tight with pain. The panic room was equipped with a trauma kit. Without thinking, she got up, retrieved it, and opened it on the small table. Gauze, antiseptic, bandages. She had taken a first aid course years ago, a requirement for a previous nannying job. She had never imagined she would use it to patch up a Mafia boss after a firefight in his garden. She approached him cautiously. "Let me see it." He watched her, his eyes narrowed in suspicion, but he didn't stop her as she gently took his arm. The fabric of his shirt was soaked. She took a pair of shears from the kit and carefully cut the sleeve away. The wound was worse than she thought, bleeding freely. "I need to clean it and put pressure on it," she said, her voice gaining a professional calm she did not feel. She was operating on autopilot, the shock giving way to a strange, focused clarity. She had to do this. She worked quickly, her fingers surprisingly steady as she cleaned the gash. He didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, but she could feel the rigid tension in his muscles. He just watched her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The air in the small room was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the sound of their breathing. Sophia's quiet sobs had subsided into whimpers. As she wrapped a pressure bandage tightly around his arm, her fingers brushed against the hot skin of his wrist. The contact was electric. He was all hard muscle and contained power. In this moment, stripped of his suit jacket, bleeding on the floor of his own safe room, he was more dangerous than he had ever been behind his desk. To keep her hands from shaking, she lied. As she secured the bandage, she heard a commotion outside the steel door. One of his men was calling his name, asking for orders. Dante glanced at the door, his focus momentarily shifting. Alara saw her chance. "He's fine," she called out, her voice clear and firm. "The wound is superficial. He's giving instructions to secure his mother. It was a calculated risk." A lie to his own men. She was inserting herself, creating a space for him to recover for a few precious seconds without appearing weak. It was a morally gray act, an instinctive move to protect the hierarchy, to protect him. She had crossed a line. She was no longer just an observer. She was a participant. When she finished, she looked up and found him staring at her, his expression unreadable. The fire in his eyes had been banked, replaced by something deeper, more complex. "You should have run when I told you to," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alara met his gaze, the lie she had just told hanging in the air between them. You knew I wouldn't, she replied, her voice just as quiet. That was it. That was the confession. Not of love, but of something far more potent and dangerous. An acknowledgement of the choice she had made, and his acceptance of it. In the silence that followed, a new understanding was forged between them, sealed in blood and gunpowder. They were no longer just boss and employee. They were allies, survivors. And that bond was more terrifying and more thrilling than any emotion she had ever known. They stayed in the panic room for an hour, the world outside their steel cocoon muted and distant. When Marco finally gave the all-clear, the mansion they emerged into was not the same one they had left. It was a place violated. Shards of glass littered the hallway from a shattered vase. The air was acrid with the smell of cordite. Dante's men moved with a quiet, lethal purpose, their faces grim. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. A new reality settled over Allera. The bubble of safety she had felt within the estate walls had been an illusion. There was no safety here. There was only Dante, a human fortress of muscle and will, and the temporary lulls between storms. They thought the confession in the panic room had created a new, stable ground between them. But the ground in Dante Moretti's world was never stable. Later that night, after Sofia was settled in her room, medicated for shock and sleeping a restless, dream-haunted sleep, Dante summoned Allera back to his study. The room had been tidied, but a new tension permeated the air. He stood by the window again, his injured arm in a black sling that disappeared against his dark suit. The Rizzos will not stop, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was the voice he used for business, for death. Today was a test. They wanted to see my response. They wanted to see if I had any weaknesses. His eyes flickered to her. They found one. Allera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He meant her. He meant his mother. He meant the very sentimentality he had warned her against. What my enemies don't know, he continued, turning to face her fully, is that what they see as a weakness, I will turn into a weapon. He walked to his desk and unlocked a drawer. He removed a small, heavy object and placed it on the polished wood between them. It was a compact, semi-automatic pistol. You will learn to use this, he said. It was not a suggestion. Marco will teach you. Starting tomorrow. You will carry it at all times. You are no longer a civilian in this house. You are part of its defense. Allera stared at the gun. It was cold, black, and utterly alien. An object of pure violence. Her hands, which had so recently tended to his mother with gentleness, which had bandaged his wound with care, were now being ordered to hold this. It was a definitive, irreversible step into his world. The morally gray line she had crossed by lying for him was nothing compared to this. This was a point of no return. I'm a caregiver, she whispered, the words sounding hollow and naive even to her own ears. You are whatever I need you to be, he replied, his voice absolute. And right now, I need you to be a survivor. The final confrontation did not happen at the mansion. It happened in a place that was supposed to be neutral territory, a private wing of a hospital where Sofia had a routine checkup. The Rizzos were smarter than Dante had anticipated. They didn't hit the fortress. They hit the inevitable, necessary journey outside it. They were in the parking garage, moving toward the armored car, when the attack began. Two sedans screeched around the concrete pillars, blocking their exit. Men with guns poured out. Marco and the other guards moved instantly, forming a human shield, returning fire. Dante shoved Allera and Sofia's wheelchair behind a massive concrete support pillar. Stay here, he roared over the cacophony of gunfire. He drew his own weapon and joined the fray. Allera's heart was a jackhammer in her chest. She had the small pistol Dante had given her tucked into the waistband of her uniform, cold against her skin. Her hands were shaking too much to even think about using it. She watched as Dante moved with that same terrifying grace she had seen in the garden, a whirlwind of controlled violence. But they were outnumbered. She saw one of his guards go down. Then another. Marco was hit, staggering back, but still firing. Dante was pinned down. That is when she saw it. A detail no one else had noticed. One of the attackers wasn't firing. He was moving stealthily along the far wall, circling around to flank Dante's position. He was going to get a clear shot at Dante's back. There was no time to shout a warning.
No time to think.
There was only time to act. Allera did not feel brave. She felt a cold, terrifying certainty. She pulled the pistol from her waistband. Her hands were slick with sweat, but her grip was firm. Marco's lessons, drilled into her over and over in the mansion's basement firing range, came back to her. Stance.
Grip. Sight. Breathe.
She wasn't a killer. She wasn't a soldier. She was a caregiver. She was a protector. She aimed not for the man, but for the large, metal fire alarm box on the wall just above his head. She squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked in her hand, the sound deafeningly close. The bullet went wide of the man but slammed into the alarm box with a tremendous clang. A shower of sparks erupted. The piercing, whooping shriek of the fire alarm blared through the garage, impossibly loud. Red lights began to flash, disorienting everyone. The flanking attacker flinched, startled by the sudden noise and light, his attention diverted for a single, crucial second. It was all the time Dante needed. He spun, his own gun firing twice. The man fell. The tide of the battle turned. The sheer noise of the alarm and the element of surprise being lost sent the remaining Rizzo men scrambling back to their cars. Within moments, they were gone, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder and the screaming alarm. Silence descended, broken only by the fading siren. Dante walked back to the pillar, his chest heaving. He looked at the smoking alarm box, then at the small pistol still clutched in Allera's trembling hands. He looked at her face, pale with shock but her eyes fierce and resolute. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say she had saved him. He holstered his weapon and walked to her, his movements stiff. One of his men, a young soldier named Paolo, had been killed in the firefight. The cost had been paid. Nothing in this world was free. Dante reached out and gently took the gun from her hand, his fingers closing over hers for a moment. His touch was warm and firm. He looked down at her, and for the first time since she had met him, the coldness in his slate-gray eyes was gone, replaced by an emotion so raw and intense it made her breath catch. Allera, he said. Her name. It was not a question, not a command. It was an acknowledgement, a claim. In his world, loyalty was the highest currency, and she had just proven hers in a way words never could. She had not just protected him. She had acted as part of his family, instinctively, lethally. The final scene of their story did not end with a declaration or a kiss. It ended a week later, back in the grand, silent parlor. The war with the Rizzos was over, concluded in a series of quiet, brutal meetings from which Dante returned with blood on his knuckles and finality in his eyes. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the oppressive silence of before, but a stillness that felt earned. Sophia was asleep in her wheelchair, near the phonograph, a soft blanket tucked around her. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the dust motes once more. Allera stood by the window, looking out at the garden, now pristine and peaceful. She heard his footsteps on the marble, but didn't turn. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar weight. For a long time, they said nothing, simply watching the light change on the leaves. She had made her choice, that day in the parking garage. She had chosen this life, this man, this danger. She had not been rescued or seduced. She had walked in with her eyes open and had fired the gun herself. Dante moved, and she thought he might speak. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was not possessive, not demanding. It was a simple, solid connection. A silent statement. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, the same hand that had held a gun to save his life. He held it as if it were the most precious thing in his world. She didn't pull away. She simply turned her hand in his, her fingers lacing with his. This was the truth. Not a fairy tale, but a choice made in the crucible of violence. A quiet understanding in a world of noise. It was not a beginning, and it was not an end. It was simply what was. And for now, it was enough.